Evening.
Good evening.
Good evening and welcome to another Torah portion study. Tonight I would like to cover two, perhaps three topics. The first is, I believe, is kind of current, so I would like to discuss it first. We begin this week a new portion, a new book, the second book of the Torah, the book of Shemot. And the name of the portion is also Shemot. The first portion is always the name of the book. In the beginning, we read that the Jewish people had started a whole new generation after the old generation has passed on. No one is left, years go by, and suddenly there is a new king that arose, a new Pharaoh, and he tells his people the following. That's number 8, chapter 1, verse 8. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He denied the existence of Joseph. Some say he didn't really know it, but it's impossible. He decided to ignore the history of Joseph saving the land. He said to his people, look, the nation of Israel's descendants are more numerous and stronger than we are. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they increase. For if a war will occur, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and depart from the land. And that was the catalyst that created the slavery that went on for over 80 years, from the birth of Moshe until Moshe is 80 years old for taking them out of Egypt. When someone will ask, what really was the core? Why did they decide to enslave the Jewish people? The Torah tells us that the Egyptians feared that the Jewish people will assist the enemy in conquering the land, like a fifth column, as we call it, from within the land to assist the enemies. Was it true or not? And the answer is it's obviously not true. The Jewish people, the Hebrews, were citizens of the country, fulfilling their duties, participating in every part of society, and they had no thoughts of conquering the land. They had no thoughts of assisting the Egyptians' enemies. In fact, there is a mitzvah to pray for the welfare of the king or the ruler in any country we live, as there's nothing to do with being Jewish or not. And until very recently, and until this very day, in England, they have a prayer for the welfare of the Queen and the government. And there used to be all over Europe. In Morocco, they still pray for the welfare of the king, not for fear, but because it is the only assurance for peace and tranquility. If there is no government that rules, if there is no fear of the men of the law, then chaos ensues, and it is dangerous for all citizens. And therefore, as part of our commandment to live in a peaceful place, we always, as Jews, are commanded to pray for the welfare and the success of the ruler, regardless if it's a dictatorship or a democracy. So what is this that bothered the Egyptians that they decided to try and decrease their numbers and get rid of them? One of the hints to it appears in this week's portion in numerous places, and I'll try and point them out. And the true answer, the most solid answer, explanation given is simply jealousy. They were jealous of the success of the Jewish people.
Right.
They could not stand the fact that the Jewish people, those men who work hard, they toil in their office or in the field, they always are able to come home to a very loving wife, and their children are always happy to share their experiences. The children are always going out to the park with their parents and are behaving properly. This is something they could not stand. The Egyptians said to themselves, the source of wealth, all success is in our hands. We are the wealthiest. We have as many women as we want. We can have as many children as we want. Yet, internally, there was no happiness. There is no tranquility. They saw at one point in their life, they started thinking and realizing that their life is hollow. And yet the Jewish people, the Hebrews, somehow managed to put a smile on their face. They didn't have the best doctors, they didn't have the greatest homes, but yet they were always happy. And upon searching, they discovered that the home, the emphasis that a Jewish person puts on their children, and children come before themselves, is at the core of their success. They decided to break the Jewish home. And their target was to diffuse husbands and wives, to make sure they have no time to raise children, to make sure they have enough and plenty reasons to argue and fight and not be able to live in harmony. And that's why we will see it in this week's portion, how they did it in a very clever way. However, it failed. The first place we see is that water plays a major role in this week's portion. First, they order all male-born boys to be born, that are born to be thrown into the Nile. Also, we see later that actually they were punished through water. They drowned in the water as a measure for measure. According to our sages, they shut down the mikvahs. A mikveh is a body water, a body of water, a source of natural water in which the wife immerses herself prior to having relationship after the period. And by forbidding the women from going to a mikveh, they were trying to separate husband from wife. And then by ordering that all male born to be thrown into the Nile, they're trying to wage a mental war against the Hebrews, to try and convince them to give up on having children, because if the child will be born, he will only meet his end with great suffering through the drowning in the Nile. And that's why they enslaved the Jewish people. They didn't need actually the work that was performed was for no purpose. All they did is to try and break their pride, try and break their energy. So when they come home, they have no time to be with their wives. They have no time to socialize. What do the Jewish people do? They actually devise new ways to live together in harmony. We read in the Torah that the wives would find, even though at night, by the time the husband came from work, he was so tired, he fell on his bed, he had no time to be together and socialize. So what does the Jewish woman do? They go out to the field and they are bringing their husbands a nice hot lunch. They also beautify themselves, and they bring a mirror, and they tell their husbands, come, let's look in the mirror, see how I look next to you. And by doing so, they would arouse their husbands, and they would have relationship under the trees in the field. Our sages tell us that God endeared this type of commitment to the future of the families, that later on it is the reason that God chose to take out the Jewish people from Egypt. We find the prophets tell us that because of those women who sacrificed their modesty and sacrifice everything they have just so they can have few more children, it is what made God say, these are my people and I want to be connected with them. And that's why we find that Amram was the Jewish leader at the time, the father of Aaron and Miriam, when the decree of Pharaoh that all male-born child should be thrown into the river, he divorced his wife. The plan, Pharaoh's plot, was working, because when Amram, the president of the Jewish people, divorced his wife, he told his wife, Those days, they did not have the pill yet. They didn't have any preventive measures for pregnancy. He says to his wife, why should we be together? You can get pregnant, and then our child will be suffering before he dies by drowning. So he divorced his wife. Pharaoh is all excited. The Jewish people, all of them divorced the women because they followed the leader. Miriam, a Jewish girl, turned to her father and she says to him, you are worse than Pharaoh. Pharaoh made a decree that only male-born be thrown into the Nile. He's trying to get rid of all the boys. You, by your action, caused not only boys not to be born, to not be future of the Jewish people, but even girls now, because you divorced mom, and all the men who follow you divorce their wives. So you are worse than Pharaoh. Metaphorically, what it means, she said to him, the plot, Pharaoh's plot, to try and break the Jewish people apart is exactly what you're doing. You're assisting Pharaoh in his plot. And that's why he returned his wife. He went back to her, remarried her, and miraculously she had a child by the name of Moshe, as we all know him. And obviously the decree stopped because the Egyptians saw that no matter what they do, they will not be able to stop. They can hurt, they can maim, they can cause lots of suffering, they can take away our rights, but the Jewish people will find a way to survive because it's a promise made by God. So this is one, and by the way, later on, when it came to the building of the tabernacle, I hope everyone, most of you are aware that the sink, the basin by which every priest needed to wash his hands and feet prior to serving God, those basins, this basin, huge basin, was created from those mirrors, the pieces of copper that the Jewish women used to create a connection with their husbands, which Moses thought that it's vanity and there is no room for it in the holy temple. And God says to him, not only there is a place for it in the holy temple, but it is the foundation on which the entire service of God stands. A kohen, a priest, cannot enter the holy temple and serve God without first washing his hands in that basin, which was made of the mirror, the copper that you served as mirrors for the women to connect with their husbands and have children. And I think for us, what we need to understand is there are times when animosity and hatred has no reason. They may come up with different excuses, but the truth is plain jealousy. And their fight is not just about the physical human being. They're not trying to get rid of one or two persons. They're in the core, the values of what Jewish people are about, which is the future, the next generation. And therefore we sacrifice everything for our children. We change our habits. We are living through a lifestyle that we wish we didn't have to be bound by certain restrictions, because I have to be home, I have to feed the children, I have to pay for their education. There are so many restrictions when it comes to raising children. And at times someone might say it doesn't make sense, it's too difficult. I would like to be live a liberated life. I'm living in a time where everybody can do what they want. Having children is exactly the opposite. You cannot do anything you want. You actually are life dictated by others. Yet we are doing it out of great love because we know that this is the greatest, this is what made us such special people, being raised in a complete home with a father and a mother, where the parents knew that children is the priority, and they knew that the needs of the children come before their own needs, and they knew that living a free life as a single man does not even compare to living a life where I'm committed and helping to raise another human being. And that applies not necessarily for Jewish people, it applies to any family, any situation where people put children first. I must say that I speak many times, I find those Catholics who are so devoted to their families and children, being that I homeschool, I must share with you a very short personal experience. When I moved here in 1990, there was no such thing as online school. Today, thank God, my kids are on online school. Oh, and how much they learn. Oh, how many friends they have. But in the first 10 years or 15 years until 2005, perhaps, the first 15 years for sure, we raised our children. Sarah took the burden, and I participated as well. So how do we socialize with our kids? We discovered that there are so many couples who did not like the public system education. And I know we have some people who served in the public school, so I'm not speaking anything negative, but they felt that for their children, it's best if they devoted their life in homeschooling. So they needed socializing. Once a week, we would meet in different parks, families of those who raised children in homeschool. This was so prevalent, we had no clue when we moved to town. But 2 years later, 3 years, when my oldest son was 4 years old and he was starting to homeschool, suddenly by word of mouth, there was no online, there was no chatting, there was no Facebook. We started discovering so many people, and by making phone calls, ourselves calling people and participating in that network, we would meet every week, once a week, on a Tuesday from 10 to 12 or 12 to 2. And those children would socialize with other children. And I discovered how many people who are not Jewish, most of them were religious. As I said, as far as I remember, the Catholics, they care so much about education, and they did not want anything. They did not want the public system, and they would put everything on the line. They might have not been very wealthy, but they were very, very happy because they knew they do the right thing. And I believe that this is the secret. This is what keeps us going, because when we were raised in solid homes where the parents knew their role and they knew their purpose and they knew that they have to devote themselves to their children, it created a beautiful product. When children today are raised in a single parent home or a broken home, God forbid, and unfortunately it is all too often more than you can imagine. I don't feel sorry for the parents, because I say to myself, they are adults, they're on their own, they can make decisions, they should be able to, if they need to seek help. But those children who are raised in those broken homes, you ask yourself only the simple question, how do you expect them to be the parents of the next generation? And unfortunately, there are no good answers for that. There is no good answer. And that's the breakage, that's the, so to say, cracks that shatters the future of humanity or the society. And I just want to finish off with saying that, for example, in Europe today, the greatest, they suffer mostly from a shrinking. The societies are shrinking. France, Germany, Switzerland, Finland, all those countries, beautiful countries, but somehow they want to be so liberated that the children, a single child from both parents, figured, if my parents want to put their needs first, then why do I need to get married? And therefore, they are not interested in having children. And those countries are losing citizens by leaps and bounds, despite all the incentives they offer today, an enormous type of incentives that are offered for every child being born in those countries. It is very difficult for them. There is a negative growth, and all the predictions say that without major, so to say, dramatic change, they don't see future in 50 or 70 years. They see no people living in those countries, unfortunately. So this is one point, and this is the core, the difference between Pharaoh, his jealousy. There was something he did not have, and he figured by taking it away from the Jewish people, it will make him feel better. And unfortunately, it didn't work out. The Jewish people would find ways, despite the sacrifices and difficulties they had to go through, and they were able to continue on and grow. Their growth, as the Torah says, the more they abused them, the greater, the bigger they got, because they realized that's the only answer to those abusers. When instead of interacting with them and trying to fight them, we continue doing what we know is right to do. And by having larger families and more Jewish people, it is the greatest defeat to the enemy. This is as the Torah tells us in this week's portion. So this is one point. I hope I did not veer too much and I did not offend anybody. There's another central theme that appears in this week's portion, and that is the appreciation and reciprocating of kindness. For those of us who speak Hebrew, we call it hakarat hatov. For someone to be able to appreciate the good that somebody else did for him, there is a deeply rooted responsibility and obligation to show the appreciation, and should not be taken for granted, assuming that the other person knows that I care, the other person knows that I appreciate it, the other person knows that I am grateful. This is not enough. We need to show our appreciation. I have here six sources in this week's portion. I will go through them very quickly to show you how deep this value is rooted within the Jewish people. The first is, we know that Moses, when he was assigned by God to punish Pharaoh and the Egyptians, the first plague was what? Blood. How did they bring the blood? They needed to hit the dirt, the sand, the ground. God tells Moshe to ask Aaron to hit the ground. Why not Moshe? Many other activities were performed by Moshe, but hitting the dirt had to be done only by Aaron and not by Moshe. And the answer is, I hope many of you are aware, because when Moshe killed the Egyptian, there was an Egyptian officer abusing a Jewish slave. And Moshe looked around, nobody was watching, he killed the man and he buried them in the ground, under the soil. Says the Medrash that God told Moshe, you have benefited from the soil and therefore you must show appreciation. You should not hit with your rod the soil. And I have three questions to that. Number one is, it's not the same soil. It's a different soil that he's hitting. Number two, soil don't get hurt. I never heard of soil getting hurt. What's wrong with hitting it? And number three, anyway, somebody has to do it. It's not about doing it or hitting the soil or not. The soil had to be heated by the rod. It was through Aaron. So what's the difference if Moshe or Aaron do it? And the answer is, God tells Moshe that you are the beneficiary from the soil. It protected you. Therefore, from the point of view of the one who benefited, you may not do so as a sign to show your appreciation to the soil. So it may not be the same, and it may not get hurt. And anyway, someone is going to eat the soil. But you, as the recipient of certain benefit from the soil, are forbidden from hitting the soil. That's why Aaron, anytime there was something involved hitting the ground, it was done by Aaron and at Moshe as a sign of appreciation for a benefit he received from the soil. Number two, in this week's portion, we read about Moshe running away from Pharaoh and arriving in Midian. And he's standing by the well. And the daughters of Pharaoh come to draw water, and the shepherds throw them into the well, and Moshe Rabbeinu Moses saves them and helps water and give water to the sheep, to the flock. They come home early because Moshe helped them. And their father, Jethro, turned to his daughters, he only had daughters, and say, why did you come so quick today? This is in this week's portion. And they told them, an Egyptian man saved our life, and he also drew water for all our flocks. One can ask, and we'll talk about it soon. One can ask, what do you mean an Egyptian man? How did they know he's Egyptian? Who says he was an Egyptian? Medrash tells us, in fact, he was a Hebrew. He wasn't an Egyptian. He didn't look like an Egyptian. How do they say an Egyptian man had saved us? The Medrash tells us that Moshe, when he talked to the girls after they thanked them for being saved, the Moshe turned to they said, thank you for saving our life. Thank you for helping us provide water to our flocks. Moshe says, do not thank me. Thank an Egyptian officer I killed. Because had I not killed them, I wouldn't have to run away and arrive here. In other words, he points out to a man that is dead, that never intended to assist them, but yet he gives them the credit because only because he killed this evil man, he had to run away and be in the well and save the daughters of Jethro. And that's why they tell their father, an Egyptian man assisted us, and he also helped us draw water, referring not to Moshe, but referring to actually the officer, the Egyptian officer that Moshe had killed prior to escaping Egypt, arriving in Midian. And that's why Jethro turned to them and he says, how come you did not show appreciation with action? He says, where is he? And they say, well, we don't know. He's at the well. He says, go back and bring him in. Let us show appreciation, not with words. He acted, right? He did something. He put his life on the line to save you. He helped you water the flax. Bring him here. Let us show appreciation with action. And he offered them a meal, and later he gives them his oldest daughter, Zipporah. Zipporah is a wife. It all was done as a sign of appreciation for what Moshe had done for his daughters. Number 4, we read about Amram, the father of Moshe. The Torah tells us, I think I shared with you very briefly, his daughter complained that he's worse than Pharaoh. And despite the danger and the challenge, she goes and marries his wife. And God had showed them appreciation by giving him a son named Moshe. The Medrash tells us that he did not put in a lot of thoughts into how will I be able to live with my wife and raise children. He did not think about where am I going to find the money to raise my child, to pay for the health insurance, and to find the time to take them to a doctor visits, and how will I pay for his college tuition. He just said, if that's what God wants us to do, to make sure that the children come first, and we have to be blessed with children, God will provide. And because of doing so, God had helped them as a karata tov, as appreciation for his, so to say, sacrifice, giving up so much of himself. God had blessed him with a son called Moshe. Another place, number 5, we find when the two ladies, Shifra and Pua, Miriam and Yocheved, sacrificed themselves and refused to heed Pharaoh's order to stop the birth of the Jewish woman. God, the Torah tells us, God had blessed them with very special reward that their children will be the kings and the priests of the Jewish people. It is a reward for their sacrifice going against the order of Pharaoh. And finally, one more, and that is Pharaoh's daughter, who can take a whole lesson. Pharaoh's daughter is sacrificing her life just for saving Moshe. And the reward is that Moshe, even though had 10 different names, his father named them, his brother named them, God had named them, the Jewish people named them, he had 10 names. Not one of them is mentioned in the Torah other than an Egyptian name. Moshe is a word in Egyptian. Pharaoh's daughter named him Moshe, meaning I drew him out of water. And that's the only name. The books of Moses, the Torah of Moses, the name Moses appeared more than any other name by far in the Torah, in our 5 books of Moses. And the reason we are hearing that name only, although the Medrash, and I know many of the other names Moshe had, is as an appreciation for the heroic move that Pharaoh's daughter did against her father to save this young child. She didn't know what his future is going to be like. She didn't know. All she knew is that he was a Hebrew child, as the Torah in this week tells us. She knew it must be a Hebrew child because he was circumcised. Yet she refused to heed her father's decree. Just imagine Hitler has a daughter and she adopts a child, a Jewish child, and raise him in Hitler's house. That's what Pharaoh's daughter did. Batya is her name, the daughter of God. That's what Batya is. And that's why Zakarat Tov, as appreciation for the kindness, the kind act that she had done, the name Moshe, she named this child, is the only name that stuck. And throughout history, we know, throughout history, throughout the universe, we know him as Moses or Moshe, as a name that not the father, not the mother, not God, not the Jewish people, but only the daughter of Pharaoh. So here are 6 points in this week's portion as we see that we need to be appreciative anytime someone acts or does something in kind to us, and never spare an opportunity to show appreciation. And with that, I would like to conclude and wish everyone Shabbat Shalom. And I hope to see you all well and happy soon. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom,
Shabbat
Rabbi.
shalom.